Hello, and welcome to the second of the two presentations on civility and education. In this second presentation, we'll focus on civility and online communication, and we'll think about some of the educational questions and issues that are raised by recent research on civility in online forums. Again, I'm Andrew Peterson, Professor of Character and Citizenship Education in the Jubilee Centre for Character and Virtues at the university. And you have my email there if you have any questions that you want to follow up after listening to this presentation and engaging with the readings that you'll find on the Canvas page. It's undoubtedly the case that much of our communication in everyday life now occurs in online spaces or in a fluid movement between online and offline spaces. And this is true also of political communication, whether it's posting a tweet on Twitter, whether it's retweeting or liking a tweet, whether it's sharing information, political information on Facebook or some other form of online communication. Political communication has been changed, some would argue, irrevocably by online spaces. And this presents some challenges, particular challenges for civility and incivility online. So what are these challenges? Well, firstly, we have anonymity, the ability to hide behind a profile seems to, or the literature suggests, may well make people say things and offer opinions and share perspectives that they wouldn't do in face-to-face communication. And we'll come back to that on the next slide. Secondly, we have the challenges that often communication is asynchronous, and actually that communication is very fluid. So we have instant communication, but we also have communication that might get posted and outdated, or it might change our perspective. It might simply frame something in the wrong way, but it's there and it's engaged within asynchronous and synchronous ways. Communication online is ad hoc and is often short-lived, but we have a digital history as well and a digital past. So again, there's a tension or somewhat of paradox there. Communication online is more detached than face-to-face communication, meaning that we often miss intentions, body language, interpretation becomes more important. We think, for example, even just interpreting a communication by email and the intention behind it is much more difficult in online communication than when we're communicating face-to-face. Research suggests that online communication may mask our true character, intentions and beliefs, and we only need to think about the issue of catfishing here to see how we can pretend to be somebody else online and how much easier it is to pretend to be somebody else to mask our true character in an online discussion than in real life and in face-to-face communication. The communication may not be based on an ongoing relationship and a community. And I think that's absolutely crucial, because when we communicate with somebody face-to-face, we are aware of our previous and our historical relationships and our communications with them. And that may mean that we give them some leeway, we can contextualize the point they're making, we can perhaps forgive some miscommunications and some miswording and misphrasing, but we might be less inclined to do that in an online communication where we don't necessarily have that ongoing relationship and that sense of community. And then we have a further challenge of, well, what happens when online democratic communication goes wrong? And again, we'll return to that in a later slide. So just touching on the challenges introduced in the last slide, here's something that I've linked you into the video for this of the American Psychological Association, had a panel discussion at one of their conferences on civility and incivility. And that's a video you can watch in the resources that support these presentations. And this is something that Jonathan Haidt, who is one of the leading psychologists in America interested in character and moral behavior, this is something Jonathan Haidt says. This is what really scares me. A civil society needs lots of different zones where different practices and norms take place. What we do in the public square when we yell at each other has to be different from what we do in the classroom, which has to be different from what we do in the doctor's office or the courtroom or anywhere else. Social media has knocked down all the walls. It's all the same everywhere. Everything is politics all the time. And I think that quote from Haidt raises a couple of questions, and again, educationally relevant and philosophically relevant questions about our political interaction, whether it's online or elsewhere. Now, the example, this stems in Haidt's the conversation, and Haidt draws on an example of a politician who's having dinner with his family at a restaurant, and some other patrons in the restaurant are shouting abuse at this politician. And what Haidt says is that this is an example of these barriers, these walls, these practices breaking down. So everywhere is the same. The walls have been knocked down. And that actually, because people are communicating in a particular uncivil way online, then they're more likely to take that into other areas of their life. And actually that, that idea about how we behave in one setting is different to how we behave in another setting is becoming collapsed. And I think there's a second point there about everything is politics all of the time. And it goes back to something we mentioned in the first presentation, and that's how we can trust each other, have a healthy sense of skepticism and to question views. But society and democratic societies needs a certain level of trust in each other. Otherwise, the whole project collapses. If I can't trust anything anyone says or anything any of my political opponents say, then the whole basis of the political relationship falls down, leading to instability. And so it's the case that if everything is politics all the time, then we don't get to move away from politics and everything becomes defined by politics. And we're living in a time aided by social media and some of the limits of social media and the negatives of social media. We're living in a time where too readily we assume something about somebody's character by the political position that they hold. Now, this is something that perhaps is less problematic. If somebody's a racist, for example, then that tells us something more about their character. But we're living in a time where this isn't just about extremes. This is about what were traditionally mainstream politics. So to be conservative in certain environments is to be a problem. To be pro-Brexit is to be a problem and is read as saying something about somebody's character. And so it can lead to more stereotyping. There's lots of data and research on the Brexit vote, for example. It says actually, the idea that pro-Brexiteers were of a particular kind only referred to a small group, and same with pro-Europeans. And actually, if you look at most people saw strengths and weaknesses in being part of the European Union. So actually, there was much more in common between people who voted pro-EU or pro-Brexit, voted to remain in the European Union, or voted to leave the European Union in a referendum. And actually, the polarisation only occurred with very small minorities within the either leave or the remain vote. Okay, so these concerns with political communication online noted, what does existing research on online civility tell us, and what types of educational questions might this raise? Well, let's focus on the first of those questions. And it's important to note from the outset that generally research that engages with and explores online civility and online incivility generally examines posts on political news sites and or on discussion boards. So whilst there's a much deeper and broader and to some extent richer literature of studies that focus on political communication or political activism online more generally, research on online civility is perhaps a little more narrow in terms of focusing on these forms of political news sites and discussion boards as a way of thinking through online political communication and civility and incivility. We should also recognise that research typically makes a distinction between incivility and impoliteness. So, for example, Papagiorgitsi, in her work, distinguishes between civility and incivility and impoliteness. So comments that are uncivil or show a level of incivility are those comments that use threats or that invoke negative stereotypes. In contrast, impolite comments are those which exhibit rudeness, name-calling, and so on. Thirdly, the research generally suggests that incivility is not quite as widespread as it may seem in terms of online political communication. So here are some studies. Rowe in 2015 argued that, in line with previous research, the majority of comments in their sample were neither uncivil nor impolite. So, for example, of Rowe's analysis of 498 website comments, only 30 of these, 6%, evidenced incivility, as did only 13, 2.7%, of Facebook comments. And that is in line with the research of Papagiorgitsi, who drew similar conclusions in 2014. But existing studies on online political communication and civility, incivility, tell us something else that I think is perhaps more interesting than just whether it goes on or not and the levels of which people are civil or incivil in online political communications. And that's about modelling. And these studies generally suggest that where civility is concerned, modelling really helps. But where incivility is concerned, modelling doesn't help and actually serves to limit the discussion and the deliberation at hand. So what does this mean? Well, studies suggest then that when civility is modelled online, further civility results. So that means that if I'm engaging in an online political forum and I see others engaging in civil ways and demonstrating civility and modelling civility as part of that deliberation, then I myself am more likely to engage in civil ways. And we can see this perhaps being true offline as well. So to some extent that stands to reason. So for example, if I go to a local neighbourhood group that's concerned about a particular local issue, if I engage with others whose views I disagree with and they start to engage with me in civil ways, then I'm more likely to be civil myself. And that, in a way, it seems fairly reasonable to assume that, generally speaking, that might be the case. Equally, if I go to my local community group and engage with others who have a different political opinion to me or perspective to me, and they're incivil, then perhaps I'm more likely to be uncivil to them in response. But the really interesting point here, and the really important point that I think is crucial educationally as well, is that that modelling does not seem to occur with incivility. So the studies generally suggest that where incivility is being modelled, it doesn't necessarily lead to further incivility. So just to make sure this point is absolutely clear, if I engage in a political discussion board and I see others being uncivil to each other, it doesn't necessarily mean that I will then just resort to incivility. Rather, it means that I will usually do one of two things. The first is to engage in meta-communication. So to take a step back and start commenting on, for example, how discussion boards should be run, how the posts have run to this point, how they're uncivil, and the importance of operating in a civil and conducting ourselves civilly more generally. So almost taking a step removed from the issue at hand and saying some general things about the importance of civility and problems with incivility online. So that's one thing. The second response that might occur is that people just check out. So they just leave the conversation. So when they come across posts that are uncivil, that they don't wish to engage with, they just leave the conversation. And we might see that as bringing a halt to the conversation and a very abruptive end to that online communication. And there are studies that are at the bottom of the slide there, Chen and Liu, Ham, Brazier and Pennington, that all suggest this finding that civility is modelled and we have further civility, but incivility is when incivility occurs, we don't have further incivility, we have meta-communication or checking out. And importantly, for both meta-communication and checking out, the actual issue being discussed is no longer the focus, or the discussion comes to somewhat of an end, either by moving into meta-communication or people just cutting the communication or cutting off their involvement in that communication altogether. So having given you a brief overview of the literature and some concerns around online political communication and civility and incivility, let's think about some of the educational issues that this raises. And let's start by thinking about educating for online behaviour in schools. Well, the first thing to say is that as currently practiced, and this is particularly true of the UK, there's a dominance of rule-based approaches. So often when we're working with young children, or when schools and teachers are working with young children about online communication and online involvement, it's very much in terms of online safety, which obviously is very important, but by following a set of rules and procedures for how to engage online, what to do, what not to do, and so on. And these rule-based approaches are important. They provide important groundwork and important framework for helping young children and helping our pupils to think about their behaviour and their engagement online, but they don't do the whole job.
So why don't they do the whole job? Well, I think there's two things to say. Firstly, is they're perhaps rather abstract, they're codified, so they don't necessarily, in and of themselves, engage with where young people are themselves in their online communications. So I'll give you an example. It's a bit simplistic, but there was somebody we know who their daughter was doing a poster. She was 8 at the time, and doing a poster at school in terms of online safety, how to engage online in a safe way. And when her parents said to her, what are you doing? What are you writing about? She said, no idea what to write about because I've never actually been online, other than to sort of play the odd game on the iPad. So actually, oftentimes we assume that young people are engaging online. We assume they have particular sets of knowledge, but that knowledge is very varied, and rules, codes of conduct for online behaviour don't necessarily match up to how young people individually are actually engaging in their own worlds and their own lives in their online communications. But also, we might like to think about the cultivation of what's been termed cyber phronesis. Now, rules, as I say, play an important framework, an important guide, but they can't be the only thing, the only basis on which young people, and adults as well, engage online. And that's because we need to be able to be flexible, we need to be able to use our discernment and our judgment and our wisdom for how to respond given a particular set of circumstances and a particular context. So we need to be able to apply a whole range of considerations, a whole range of factors. We need to deliberate around those factors, which include ourselves, our own experiences, our own knowledge, the setting in which we work, our age, a whole range of factors to decide in this particular circumstance what is the best course of action, particularly when two types of action conflict. So whether it's, we might think about honesty and kindness. Should I be honest in this political communication, or should I be kind, and do they conflict? Now, we need some form of attribute or disposition that enables us to make a judgment and to discern what would be the best action, the best line of communication in given situations. Now, more generally, Aristotle advanced this notion of a meta virtue that combined the intellectual and the moral in something called phronesis, or practical wisdom, being able to discern, being able to deliberate the correct course of action given all of the factors involved, including the context. And he called that, as I've said, phronesis or practical wisdom. So, and one of your readings, a colleague of mine in the Jubilee Centre, Tom Harrison, has used this term of phronesis to think about, well, what would it mean to talk about cyber phronesis? And actually, are we educating, and how do we educate children in schools and young people to be cyber phronetic? So in their online engagements, how do we support young children to act with wisdom, to take into account a whole range of salient features, including rules, including particular conducts, but also who we're engaging with, how we're engaging with them, the relationship between online and offline communication, formal engagement, informal engagement, structured engagement, unstructured engagement, a whole range of factors to try to come to and discern and then enact the best course of action, and then to reflect and be able to reflect on that course of action, and perhaps if things have gone less well, to do things differently next time. So do have a read of that paper that's linked in with the readings on cyber phronesis, and see what you make of whether this concept is useful in terms of educating for online behaviour and online political communication in schools. To conclude the presentation, I wanted to leave you with raise some concluding thoughts that hopefully you'll be able to think about and respond to in relation to the reading that's on the Canvas page, but also your wider reading that you'll be engaging with around this topic. And I think these three thoughts, now this is a fairly burgeoning field within education. There's not much written about educating for online political communication and online civility. But here are some concluding thoughts that will hopefully pique your interest and focus your reading. So the first one is, well, what is the role of schools and teachers in educating for online civility, whether that's everyday civility or political civility, going back to the first presentation? Do schools indeed have a role in this area? and what might that role be? And I think that's something that schools are still grappling with, really, in terms of this movement from the online to the offline space, or between the online and the offline space. And connected to that, how can and do teachers mediate online issues online rather than offline? So again, I want to sort of pose that these spaces, the offline space and the online space, can work together in supportive and fluid ways, but equally they can be set up in dichotomous ways that actually work negatively and work to conflict with each other. And I think that raises a question about the response of teachers and schools to particularly where issues arise in online spaces. And often where issues arise in online spaces, they're handled offline. And I think that is perhaps problematic. So although this is an example about bullying, which is perhaps a wider concern, I think there are parallels here with online civility and incivility in political communication. But for example, oftentimes a school that has, let's say, a group of year 11 pupils are sending negative WhatsApp messages and bullying online with WhatsApps. The schools will deal with that in an offline setting. So they'll deal with that in person rather than dealing with it online. Now, that may be legitimate, it may be just pragmatically expedient, and maybe the best way to deal with it. But we have to accept that often pupils and students and young people, as with adults, will be engaging with others through online forums where the issues cannot be dealt with in an offline fashion, or at least the offline and online work in more fluid ways. And so teachers, I think, and schools have a question there and a concern there. There's certainly a challenge for how issues, when they arise, are mediated in an online setting without, for example, the meta communication that they're checking out that really, what I'm saying is, allows the conversation to continue rather than just cutting off the conversation full stop. And then that third question, does the concept of cyberphrenesis hold any potential? Going back to the reading you've been asked to do by my colleague Tom Harrison about cyberphrenesis, the Jubilee Centre is just launched a new project that over the next couple of years will look at cyberphrenesis as a concept and a term, look at what schools are doing to perhaps cultivate cyberphrenesis. So does that concept of cyberphrenesis, the idea that as well as educating our young people to follow rules and to follow particular patterns of behaviour online, crucial to online communication more generally, but in particular for political communication online, and trying to avoid incivility and promote civility, is this idea about their practical wisdom, being able to take into account a whole range of features, contextual features, agent-centered features, a whole range of features, in order to deliberate about, discern, and then enact the right course of action or the best course of action, and then to be able to reflect on that, what went well, what didn't went well, and what might they do differently next time. So I think these three questions are absolutely fundamental. Still, as we've said, a burgeoning area of interest and research, not very much research conducted on this issue of how do teachers and schools mediate political communication online with young people. What does that involve in terms of communication, and how can that communication work in less uncivil ways and in more civil ways? And I hope you've enjoyed the two presentations and the accompanying readings. Thank you.